There is a short animated film from 2006 that neither of the two men who made Rick and Morty wanted you to find. One of them called it pornographic vandalization. The other was so nervous about it during season 1 that he kept the connections between it and the show as quiet as he possibly could. That film is where this whole story begins, and most people who have watched every episode of Rick and Morty have never heard of it. What followed that film was 10 years of things the audience was never told. A creative partnership that dissolved in private while the credits kept printing both names. Season gaps that had reasons nobody disclosed. A writer's room that got harassed by its own fandom. Criminal charges filed in 2020 that stayed buried for over 2 years while the show kept airing and the promotional machine kept running. Tonight, we are walking through all of it, slowly, from the beginning. Welcome to Ricktopus. Subscribing is free, and it helps more than you know. Let us get into it. The short film that started everything. There is a short animated film from 2006 that most people who love Rick and Morty have never seen. It has no official home on any major platform. It has never been referenced in any press kit or promotional material tied to the show. The people who made it have gone out of their way at various points to make sure it stayed in the background. One of them called it, and this is his own description, a pornographic vandalization. The other one was so worried fans might find it during the making of season 1 that he quietly kept connections between it and the show as thin as possible. That film is called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty, and without it, Rick and Morty does not exist. To understand how something that obscene became the seed of one of the most successful animated series in television history, it helps to go back a little further. Back to a time before the show had a name, before it had a network, before it had an audience of millions. Back to a small, informal short film festival in Los Angeles called Channel 101, where two people who would eventually change adult animation met for the first time. Channel 101 was co-founded by Dan Harmon in 2003. The idea was simple and a little chaotic. Anyone could submit a short film, formatted like a television pilot, running no longer than 5 minutes. A live audience would then vote on which ones they wanted to see continue as a series. There were no gatekeepers. There were no standards committees. There were no executives in the room deciding what was appropriate. It was raw, creative freedom in its most literal form. And it attracted a very specific kind of person. Someone willing to make something strange, something risky, something that a traditional network would never allow near a camera. Justin Roiland was one of those people. He had been submitting work to Channel 101 since 2004, a year after it launched. His submissions were not gentle. They were described by those who watched them as sick and twisted, a phrase that sounds like a criticism, but at Channel 101 was more of a genre. His pilots received confused reactions from audiences, which, in that environment, was not necessarily a bad thing. Dan Harmon, already a known figure in that scene, noticed something in Roiland's work. There was a kind of anarchic energy there that was hard to manufacture, something uncomfortable and funny at the same time, which is the most difficult combination to pull off. The two of them began an informal collaboration, not a formal partnership, not a business arrangement, more like two people who recognized something in each other's sensibilities and kept gravitating back toward the same creative space. Then, in 2006, something happened that directly produced the short film in question. Roiland had been making a series called House of Cosby's, an animated parody featuring the comedian Bill Cosby. The series was drawing cease and desist letters from Cosby's lawyers, which was not a small problem. Roiland found himself in that particular frustrating corner that creative people sometimes get backed into, where the thing they made is being taken from them by legal pressure, and there is very little they can do about it. His response was to make something deliberately provocative, a protest piece, essentially, disguised as a comedy short. The target was Back to the Future, specifically its two main characters, Doc Brown and Marty McFly. Roiland created animated parody versions of them, renamed to avoid their own set of legal problems. Doc Brown became Doc Smith, Marty McFly became Marty McDonald's. The voices Roiland gave them were exaggerated, a gruff, rambling old scientist, a high-pitched, nervous young kid. He was having fun with the impressions, playing around with the rhythms of how those two characters sounded. And somewhere in the middle of that process, something unexpected happened. He became genuinely attached to the voices. They started to feel like something more than a parody. They started to feel like real characters. The content of the short itself is deliberately shocking. The central joke, if it can be called that, involves the older Doc character telling the younger Marty that the only way to make the time travel car work is for Marty to perform oral sex on him. This is shown in graphic animated detail. It happens more than once. The entire premise of each problem and solution in the short runs on this same structure. It was designed to to be extreme. It was designed to be the kind of thing that would make a lawyer flinch. It succeeded. Dan Harmon, looking back on it years later, chose his words carefully, but also honestly. He called it a bastardization. He called it a pornographic vandalization. Not of Rick and Morty, which did not yet exist, but of what those characters would eventually become. There is something interesting in that phrasing. He was not calling it meaningless. He was acknowledging that there was something real in those characters, even at their most grotesque starting point. The audience at Channel 101 reacted strongly to the short. Not with disgust, or at least not only with disgust, with the particular kind of shocked laughter that comes from watching something push past the boundaries of what you expected. Roiland kept making more shorts with Doc and Marty. A second one, a third. Each time he did the voices, they became more settled in his mind, more distinct, more their own thing, separate from Back to the Future, separate from the protest origins. In 2012, Harmon was briefly fired from Community, the NBC sitcom that had been his primary project for several years. Adult Swim, which was looking for its next big animated series, approached him around the same time. Harmon was not automatically enthusiastic. He had reservations about the network and doubts about his own ability to write for animation. But he made a phone call to Roiland and asked if he had any ideas. Roiland brought up Doc and Marty immediately. What followed was a transformation. Adult Swim executive Nick Weidenfeld suggested that the older character should be the younger character's grandfather, which gave the dynamic a different kind of weight. Harmon, whose instinct was always to build family structures around his characters, saw how a household could grow up around the two of them. The voices stayed almost exactly as Roiland had developed them in the short. The gruff, slightly slurred rambling of the older man. The anxious, stammering voice of the boy. Marty became Morty. Doc became Rick. The first draft of the Rick and Morty pilot was written in 6 hours on the Paramount lot in Dan Harmon's unfurnished community office. What did not survive the transformation was the explicit content of the original short. Adult Swim was edgy, but it had limits, and a show built on a teenage boy performing sexual acts on his grandfather was not going to clear those limits, not even at midnight. The show that emerged was darker in mood and stranger in premise than most animated television, but it was not what Doc and Marty had been. The connection was quietly filed away. Roiland, according to what was reported later, was genuinely nervous about the original short during the making of season 1. He worried that someone would find it, draw a line between it and the show, and create a problem before Rick and Morty had even established itself. The characters had different names, the explicit content was gone, but the voices were unmistakably the same, and anyone who watched both things back to back would feel the connection immediately. The short was not suppressed in a dramatic, institutional way. Nobody from Adult Swim sent out orders to scrub it from the internet, but it was not promoted. It was not discussed in interviews. It existed in a quiet corner of the internet where people who went looking for it could find it, but where casual fans would never stumble across it by accident. For years, the story of how Rick and Morty began was told as a clean origin. 2 talented creators, a comedy festival, a phone call, a 6-hour writing session, a show. That was the version that appeared in press materials and documentary segments and interview responses. The version where the whole thing started with a deeply obscene 5-minute protest film designed to irritate a celebrity's lawyers was not exactly hidden, but it was not brought up unless someone specifically asked, and even then the answers tended to be brief. There is a small but telling detail in how the Doc and Marty short connects to the finished show. In a season 2 episode of Rick and Morty, there is a brief flashback in which Rick enthusiastically shouts a phrase that any viewer of the original short would immediately recognize. It was slipped in quietly, a nod to the origins that only made sense if you knew where to look. The writers were aware of where they came from, they just preferred not to lead with it. By season 5, the show made another oblique reference, a scene in which Rick manipulates Morty into inspecting his body in a way that echoes the dynamic of the original short, though stripped of the explicit content and reframed as physical comedy. Audiences who had seen Doc and Marty understood what was being referenced. Audiences who had not simply laughed at the scene on its surface level. That gap between what the show's origins actually were and what most of its audience understood them to be is where this story really begins. Rick and Morty built an enormous following on the strength of its intelligence, its emotional depth, its willingness to go to places other animated shows would not. It won Emmy Awards. It broke Adult Swim viewership records. It became a cultural landmark, and it began as a joke about a teenager performing oral sex on an old man. Neither of those facts cancels the other one out. They just exist together, a little uncomfortably, in the same history, which, as it turns out, is true of almost everything connected to this show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The short film that became Rick and Morty was never meant to be anything more than a protest, a piece of animated shock humor fired off in frustration at a a legal dispute. Coming up, the two men who turned that short into a television empire, and the early cracks in their partnership that the world would not hear about for years. Section 2. The two men behind the curtain. There is a particular kind of creative partnership that looks, from the outside, like a perfect match. Two people with different skills and different instincts who seem to balance each other out. One brings the chaos and the other brings the structure. One has the raw energy and the other has the discipline to shape it into something that can actually be released into the world. From a distance, that is exactly what Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland appeared to be. The press treated them that way. Interviews framed them that way. The story of how Rick and Morty got made was told, for years, as a story of two complementary forces finding each other at exactly the right moment. The reality was more complicated and considerably more fragile, almost from the beginning. To understand how two people can build something extraordinary together while quietly drifting apart, it helps to understand who each of them was before they shared a credit line. Dan Harmon came from a world of words. He was a writer first, a builder of stories, someone who thought deeply and obsessively about structure and character and what it means for a piece of television to have something real to say. He co-founded Channel 101 not just as a creative outlet, but as a philosophy, a belief that the best work comes from total freedom and total responsibility at the same time. Nobody tells you what to make at Channel 101. Nobody protects you from your own bad ideas. You make the thing and the audience tells you immediately whether it worked. Before Rick and Morty, Harmon had created Community for NBC. It was a sitcom set in a community college, built around a group of misfits, and it was beloved by critics and a dedicated core audience in a way that never fully translated into the mainstream ratings that would have kept a network comfortable. Community was the kind of show that inspired genuine loyalty, the kind of loyalty that comes from a show feeling like it was made specifically for you. But it was also a show that burned through its creator. Harmon was known, even then, for being difficult. Not cruel, not untalented, but intense in a way that could be exhausting for the people around him. He cared deeply about the work, to a degree that sometimes made the environment around the work difficult to sustain. In 2012, he was fired from Community. Not gently eased out, fired. The show continued without him for a season, which did not go well, and he was eventually brought back. But the firing was a public and humbling thing, and it happened right before Adult Swim came calling. He arrived at the Rick and Morty project carrying that with him. A brilliant mind, a bruised ego, and a very clear sense of what he thought good television required. Justin Roiland came from a different direction entirely. He was primarily a voice actor and an animator, someone whose instinct was to create through performance rather than through structure. He was funny in an improvisational, unpredictable way. The voices he developed were not worked out through careful planning. They emerged from play, from experimentation, from the kind of relaxed creative state where the most unexpected things sometimes appear. Rick and Morty's voices were not crafted. They were discovered. Roiland had tried and failed to get animated shows off the ground at Fox before Rick and Morty. 3 different pilots that never made it to series. That kind of repeated near miss takes a toll on a person. By the time he sat down with Harmon to write the Rick and Morty pilot, he had been knocking on doors in animation for years without any of them opening in the way he needed. He was hungry for the show to work, but he was also, according to what Harmon described later, already a little burned out on the development process itself, already a little tired of being told what his characters should be. They wrote the pilot quickly. 6 hours, Harmon's office, the broad strokes of what the show would become laid out with a speed that suggested the ideas had been waiting for the right moment to land. There was genuine creative excitement in those early days. That part of the story is real. Something clicked when the two of them were in the same room working toward the same thing, and the show that emerged from that collaboration was better for having both of them involved. But there was always a tension underneath it, and it was a tension that came from a very specific source. Harmon's natural way of making television involved writers' rooms, a group of experienced professional writers gathered in a room to generate and refine ideas together. This is how Community was made. This is how most hour-long and half-hour dramas and comedies in American television are made. It is a collaborative model, built on the assumption that the best ideas survive a room full of smart people, and that the showrunner's job is to guide that process, rather than to generate every idea alone. Roiland had a different relationship to that model. Rick and Morty had started as his. The characters, the voices, the basic dynamic between the old man and the kid. Whatever Doc and Marty had been, it was his creation. And as the show grew and the writer's room filled with professional television writers, many of whom had worked with Harmon before on Community, something shifted for Roiland. The room began to feel less like a collaboration and more like a takeover. Harmon spoke about this later, carefully and with genuine, apparent regret. He said that his intention had been to make things easier for both of them, that a strong writer's room would take pressure off Roiland as much as off himself, that the dream had been for the two of them to be what he called idea men, people who set the direction and then let the machinery of professional television writing do the heavy lifting, freeing them both up to be creative without being exhausted. He had not understood, or had not fully understood, that Roiland did not experience the growing writer's room as relief. He experienced it as displacement. The phrase that Harmon used was telling. He said that Roiland had apparently felt that Harmon brought in his Harmon writers. Not the show's writers, not their writers, Harmon's writers. People who were loyal to one co-creator rather than to the show itself. Whether or not that was an accurate read of the situation, it was how Roiland experienced it. And perception in a creative partnership tends to matter more than intention. This tension did not immediately destroy anything. The first season of Rick and Morty came out in 2013, and it was received with genuine enthusiasm. Not an immediate massive explosion of popularity, but a steady and growing recognition that something new and strange and unusually good had arrived. The voices were original. The science fiction concepts were genuinely inventive. The emotional undercurrents, particularly around Rick's relationship with his family, had a weight that surprised people who expected simple, adult cartoon comedy. Season 2 followed in 2015 and expanded everything. The world got larger, the mythology got deeper, the emotional stakes got higher. Rick and Morty was becoming something that people talked about, not just as a funny show, but as a genuinely meaningful piece of television. Critics who had initially treated it as interesting but niche were now using words like brilliant. The audience was growing quickly. And behind all of that, the relationship between the two men who had made it was quietly deteriorating. Harmon described the dynamic as one where he and Roiland respected each other and, in some ways, feared each other. Both of them, he said, always wanted the other to be happy. Neither of them wanted to push the other too far, or demand too much, or make the collaboration feel like a fight. That sounds like a healthy partnership. In practice, it created a different kind of problem. Things that needed to be addressed directly were instead left alone. Tensions that needed to be named were instead worked around. A collaboration where both people are too careful of each other's feelings can drift just as badly as one where people fight constantly. It just drifts more quietly. By the time season 3 was being made, the friction had become serious enough that a mediator was brought in. This is a detail that did not make the press during production. It emerged later, years after the fact, when the full story of the show's behind-the-scenes history began to surface in pieces. A mediator, someone brought in from outside to sit between two co-creators of a wildly successful television show and try to help them find a way to keep working together. That is not a minor thing. That is a significant institutional intervention, the kind that happens when ordinary communication has stopped working. Roiland, according to what was reported, had begun to disengage. Not dramatically, not in a way that immediately showed up on screen or in the finished product, but in ways that were noticeable to the people in the room. He was harder to reach. He was less present in the creative process. He still came in to do the voices, which was the most visible part of his contribution, but the writing sessions that shaped the show's direction were increasingly happening without him. Harmon, publicly, took responsibility. He said the delays in production were his fault, his perfectionism, his slow process. He was consistent about this in interviews, which read at the time as admirable honesty from a showrunner willing to shoulder blame. Looking back, with the fuller picture available, it reads a little differently. It reads like a man covering for a partnership that was unraveling in ways he did not fully understand and could not fully control. There is a moment from Harmon's later accounts of this period that stays with you. He described the last time he and Roiland spoke in person, an emotionally charged conversation in which Roiland said things he had apparently never said before about being unhappy. Harmon told him that he was worried, that he was scared Roiland was not going to come back from wherever he was going emotionally. And then the conversation became, in Harmon's word, confrontational, and then it ended, and then they stopped speaking directly. The last real communication between them was a text message exchange. After that, there was nothing. They continued to share a credit line on a show that was airing to millions of people, winning Emmy Awards, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in merchandise, and they had stopped talking to each other entirely. The last time Harmon and Roiland communicated was 2019. Rick and Morty continued airing through 2020, 2021, and 2022 without that communication resuming. The show kept going. The press kept writing about the two creators. Promotional materials kept presenting Rick and Morty as the product of an ongoing collaboration between two people who were, in fact, no longer in contact. That gap between the public story and the private reality is one of the quieter cover-ups in this whole history. Not a dramatic concealment. Nobody lied outright. Nobody held a press conference with false information. But the image of a functioning creative partnership was allowed to persist long after it had ceased to exist, and nobody in a position to say otherwise chose to say otherwise. The show was too valuable. The brand brand was too strong. The audience had too much invested in the idea of Rick and Morty as the product of two men who were still, in some meaningful sense, making it together. Roiland was not entirely absent from the process in these later years. He still came in to record the voices. That was his most irreplaceable contribution, and he continued to show up for it. But his involvement in the writer's room, in the creative decisions, in the direction of the show he had co-created had become minimal. The people actually shaping the episodes were the professional writers Harmon had assembled, the same people Roiland had apparently resented from the beginning. There is something genuinely sad in that picture. A man who created two characters whose voices only he could produce, sitting in a recording booth delivering those voices for a show whose direction he had long since stopped influencing. A creative partner who had, in every meaningful sense except the official one, already left. Harmon, when he finally spoke publicly about all of this in 2023, described himself as ashamed. Not just about what he had later learned regarding Roiland's personal conduct, which was its own catastrophic story. Ashamed more broadly at the distance that had grown, and the things that had gone unaddressed for so long. He said he did not fully understand why the friendship had ended. He said there were parts of the story he felt he could not tell because Roiland was no longer there to give his side of it. That is an honest thing to say. It is also a reminder that most of what the public understood about the making of Rick and Morty was a curated version of events. The reality was two people who had built something remarkable together, who had stopped being able to be in the same room, who had let years pass in silence, while the thing they built kept growing larger around them. The audience watched the show. They laughed at Rick. They felt things about Morty. They debated episodes and analyzed themes, and built an enormous cultural conversation around this cartoon. Almost none of them knew that the two men whose names appeared in the opening credits had not spoken since 2019. Almost none of them knew how the whole thing had started, and almost none of them knew what was coming next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Two people built one of the most successful animated shows in television history, and then quietly stopped speaking to each other while the show kept running and the world kept watching. Next, the long silences between seasons that fans spent years trying to explain, and what was actually happening behind the scenes during all that waiting. Section 3. The Years of Silence. What caused the season gaps? There is a specific kind of frustration that comes from waiting for something you love and being told nothing useful about when it will arrive. Rick and Morty fans became very familiar with that feeling. Between seasons, the gaps stretched in ways that felt inexplicable for a show that was, by every measurable standard, one of the most successful things on television. The audience was there. The network wanted more. The creators were under contract. And still, the show would disappear for months, sometimes well over a year, without any clear explanation that satisfied the people waiting for it. The official explanations were always the same general shape. The writing takes time. Quality cannot be rushed. The team is working hard. These are not false statements. Writing a good animated television show is genuinely difficult and genuinely slow. Animation itself adds layers of production time that live action does not require. A script has to be completed, then recorded, then animated, then scored, then mixed, then delivered. The pipeline is long even when everything is going smoothly. But everything was not always going smoothly, and the gap between what the public was told and what was actually happening during those long, quiet periods is one of the most consistent and least discussed parts of the Rick and Morty story. It begins, properly, with the wait for Season 3. Season 2 ended in October 2015. It ended on a cliffhanger, which is a particular kind of cruelty to inflict on an audience that is already deeply invested. Rick surrendering himself to the Galactic Federation, the family separated, the status quo of the show completely upended. It was a bold ending for a season of television, the kind that signals a show is confident enough in its own future to leave its audience genuinely uncertain about what comes next. What came next was silence. Months of it. Season 3 did not arrive until April 2017, and even then, it arrived strangely. A single episode dropped without announcement on April Fool's Day, looping continuously on the Adult Swim website through the night. The remaining episodes did not follow until July 2017, nearly 4 months later. Fans had waited approximately a year and a half for the season to begin, and then waited another 4 months within the season itself for the rest of it to appear. During that waiting period, the questions were constant, and the answers were thin. Dan Harmon gave an interview at the Sundance Film Festival in early 2017, in which he took blame for the delay and mentioned fights, a word that immediately set off alarm bells for a fan base already anxious about the show's future. The internet amplified the word out of all proportion. Fights implied conflict. Conflict implied the show was in trouble, implied implied things the audience had not been told. Harmon walked it back almost immediately on Twitter. He clarified that the fights he had mentioned were not the dramatic kind, not arguments between himself and Roiland, not a creative partnership in crisis, just the ordinary creative friction of a writer's room working through what jokes to tell and which direction to take a scene. He called it trademark rambling on his own part. He said there was no hidden truth. He blamed himself and the slowness of the writing process and left it at that. The fans mostly accepted this. There was not much else to accept. The creators had spoken. The explanation was boring, and boring explanations are usually the true ones, except this one was not entirely the true one. What Harmon said was not a fabrication. The writing did take a long time. The perfectionism was real. But layered underneath those true things was something he did not say, something that only came to light years later when the fuller history of the show's behind the scenes began to emerge in pieces. Roiland, by the time season 3 was being produced, was already struggling to show up in the ways the show needed him to. Not the recording sessions, which he still attended, but the writing sessions, the creative conversations, the day-to-day presence in the room where the episodes were actually shaped. He was, by multiple accounts, increasingly absent from that process. Not physically gone every single day, but unreliable in a way that created real difficulties for the people trying to plan around him. The Wikipedia article for season 3, updated years after the fact with reporting that it finally surfaced, states it plainly. Roiland's inability to focus on his writing duties, along with creating distractions in the writer's room, led to various delays. This caused tension between him and Harmon significant enough that the show brought in a mediator to try to preserve the working relationship. A mediator on a cartoon show between two people whose names appeared side by side in the opening credits of every episode. The season was originally planned for 14 episodes. It was delivered as 10. 4 episodes that had been intended as part of season 3 were quietly dropped. The show got shorter, and nobody was given a clear explanation for why. The production delays had compressed what was possible, and 10 episodes was what could actually be finished and delivered to a standard that both Harmon and Adult Swim found acceptable. Season 3 aired. It was received extremely well. It won Rick and Morty its first Emmy Award for an episode called Pickle Rick, which became one of the most culturally visible things the show ever produced. The season was the highest rated in Adult Swim history. Everything on screen suggested a show at the peak of its creative powers. Everything behind the screen suggested something considerably more complicated. When season 3 ended in October 2017, the wait for season 4 began. And this wait was even harder to explain than the previous one. Season 4 was not just delayed. For a significant period, it was unclear whether it had even been ordered. Rick and Morty had finished its 3rd season as the most successful show on Adult Swim, and there was no confirmed renewal. Harmon posted on Twitter in early 2018 that season 4 had not been ordered by a network, a statement that sent the fan base into genuine panic. How could a show this successful not be renewed? What was happening in the conversations between the creators and the network that was producing this kind of uncertainty? The answer, when it eventually came, was the 70-episode deal. In May 2018, Adult Swim announced that Rick and Morty had been renewed for 70 new episodes over an unspecified number of seasons. It was an enormous order, the kind of long-term commitment that networks make for shows they consider foundational to their identity. Harmon described the negotiations as something that had temporarily brought him and Roiland back together, united against the institutional weight of negotiating with a major network. He used the phrase, "in love again," which is a striking thing to say about a co-creator you have been struggling to work with for years. But the 70-episode deal also came with a cost that was not immediately obvious. Negotiating it had taken time, lots of time. The period between the end of season 3 and the announcement of the deal had been months of contract discussions, which are not the same as production. No episodes were being written or animated while lawyers and agents were working through the terms. The machine had stopped entirely. Ryan Ridley, a writer and producer who had worked on the show, gave a podcast interview during this period that was more candid than anything coming from official channels. He said, plainly, that no work had begun on season 4, and that based on how long the show took to write and animate, he would be surprised if it appeared before late 2019. He added that he had never understood why all parties involved, and he named Harmon, Roiland, and Adult Swim, did not simply organize themselves to make the show faster. He expressed genuine bafflement at a process that seemed to work against its own interests. Season 4 premiered in November 2019, more than 2 years after season 3 had ended. The first 5 episodes aired, and then the season went on hiatus again. The remaining 5 episodes did not arrive until May May 2020. An entire season was split into two halves separated by months, a scheduling decision that was framed as a creative choice, but read to a fan base that had already spent years waiting as another layer of indefinite delay. During all of this, the public explanation remained consistent and relatively thin. Writing takes time. Animation takes time. The team is working hard. These things were true. They were also incomplete in ways that mattered. What was not said publicly during the Season 4 production period was that by this point, Harmon and Roiland had effectively stopped speaking to each other. Their last real communication, by Harmon's own later account, had been a text message exchange in 2019.
The season was being made by a writer's room that Roiland had largely disengaged from, with Roiland still providing the voices that only he could provide, and Harmon overseeing the creative direction of a show he was increasingly running alone. This is the part of the story that feels most significant in retrospect. Season 4 aired. Season 5 followed in 2021. Season 6 in 2022. 3 full seasons of Rick and Morty were produced and released while the show's two co-creators were not in contact with each other. The show had, in a functional sense, one showrunner. Harmon was making the creative decisions. The writer's room was his. The direction the show was taking was his. Roiland was still listed as co-creator, still credited as executive producer, still present in the most audible way possible, because every time Rick or Morty spoke, the audience heard his voice. But the creative partnership that the show had always been publicly presented as the product of had effectively ended several years before anyone outside the production knew about it. This created an interesting and uncomfortable situation for the press and for the audience. Interviews with the show during this period still referenced both creators. Articles about Rick and Morty still discussed its co-creators as a unit. The mythology of the show, its origin story, its identity as something made by two complementary forces, remained the version that existed in public understanding. Inside the production, things were different. Writers who joined the show in its later seasons were working in a room shaped almost entirely by Harmon. New voices and sensibilities were coming in, and the show was evolving in ways that Roiland had little to no input into. The characters he had created, whose voices were his, were going in directions he had not charted. Whether Roiland was aware of this or troubled by it is not something the public record clearly answers. What is clear is that he did not, during this period, publicly object to anything. He did not give interviews expressing frustration. He did not signal in any observable way that he felt the show had moved away from his vision. He showed up to record, and then he went home, and the show kept going. There is one additional layer to the production delays that rarely gets discussed alongside the creative and relational ones. Adult Swim itself bore some responsibility for the scheduling difficulties. The network, as Harmon noted at various points, controlled the release schedule. When episodes were ready, the timing of their broadcast was an Adult Swim decision, not a creator's decision. Some of the gaps that fans experienced as evidence of production problems were, in fact, network scheduling choices. The two things got blurred together in public perception, which was perhaps convenient for everyone involved. The 70-episode deal that was supposed to solve the gap problem by giving the show long-term stability did not, in practice, eliminate the delays. Season 7, which would come with its own very different set of complications, did not arrive until October 2023. Season 8 did not premiere until May 2025. The show remained, even in its newer era, a slow-moving production by television standards. What changed, eventually, was not the pace. What changed was everything else. And the changes that came were not the kind that could be explained away with references to perfectionism and complex animation pipelines. For years, the gaps between seasons had been treated as an inconvenience, an irritating but fundamentally harmless feature of loving a show that cared enough about quality to take its time. Fans complained, creators apologized vaguely, and everyone waited. It was frustrating, but it was manageable, because the show that eventually arrived always seemed worth it. The season gaps were, in hindsight, symptoms of something that ran much deeper than slow writing. They were the visible surface of a production that had been under internal strain for most of its existence. A co-creator who had disengaged, a partnership that had dissolved in private while persisting in public, a writer's room that was pulling in a direction the show's originator was no longer part of, and, underneath all of that, a set of personal circumstances surrounding Roiland that nobody in the industry was yet talking about out loud. The fans spent years analyzing the gaps. They speculated about creative differences, about network pressure, about contract disputes. Some of them were right about some of it. None of them had the full picture, because the full picture was considerably darker than anything the production wanted to put in front of an audience that had shown up season after season, ready to wait as long as it took. That willingness to wait, that loyalty, was one of the things that made it possible for the real story story to stay buried as long as it did. When an audience loves something enough, it tends to give the people who make it enormous amounts of benefit of the doubt. Rick and Morty had earned that benefit of the doubt many times over, and the people who knew what was actually happening behind the cameras had little incentive to spend it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The gaps between seasons turned out to be the least complicated thing about what was happening behind the scenes, because while fans were waiting and wondering, something much more serious was building inside the fandom itself. Next, the year the audience became the story. Section 4. The fandom that turned on its own show. It is worth taking a moment to think about what a television fandom actually is before getting into what this particular one did. A fandom is, at its most basic, a group of people who love the same thing. They gather in comment sections and forums and subreddits. They make fan art and discuss theories and argue about which episodes are the best and which ones miss the mark. Most of the time, this is harmless. Sometimes it is genuinely wonderful. People find community through shared enthusiasm for a piece of culture, and that community can be meaningful in ways that have nothing to do with the show itself. Rick and Morty had one of the largest and most devoted fandoms in adult animation. It had formed quickly, grown rapidly, and developed its own internal language, its own in-jokes, its own hierarchy of knowledge. Knowing the show well was a form of social currency in certain online spaces. Being able to quote it, to reference it correctly, to demonstrate that you had watched closely enough to catch the background details and the subtle callbacks meant something to the people who cared about it. The show itself, in some ways, encouraged this. Rick and Morty was explicitly interested in its own audience. It made jokes that rewarded careful viewing. It built mythology that paid off only if you had been paying attention across multiple seasons. It treated its viewers as intelligent people who could handle complexity and ambiguity and ideas that did not resolve neatly. That is a generous thing for a show to do, and the audience responded to it with genuine intensity. That intensity, in 2017, turned in a direction that nobody associated with the show was proud of. The specific trigger was the hiring of female writers for season 3. The first 2 seasons of Rick and Morty had been written by an all-male writing staff. This was not unusual for adult animation at the time. The industry, and Adult Swim in particular, had a well-documented problem with the representation of women in creative roles. A report on Adult Swim's 2016 development slate found 0 female creators among its new and returning shows. The network's senior vice president of programming had apparently made remarks suggesting that having women in a writer's room produced conflict rather than comedy, a view that was reported by former employees and that painted a fairly clear picture of the institutional culture Harmon was working within. Harmon, for his part, made a deliberate decision going into season 3 to change the composition of the writing staff. He brought in female writers. Among them were Jessica Gao and Jane Becker. This was not a secret. It was not hidden from the public. Harmon spoke about wanting to diversify the room and bring in new voices. The intention was transparent. The result, on screen, was a season that many critics considered the show's best. Season 3 was tighter, more emotionally precise, more willing to give its secondary characters real interiority. The episode Pickle Rick, written by Jessica Gao, won the Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. The episode that explored Beth's childhood, written with significant contributions from the new writers, was widely praised as one of the most emotionally complex things the show had attempted. The season received the highest ratings in Adult Swim history. A segment of the fan base decided the season was terrible and that the female writers were responsible. This is where the story stops being about a television show and starts being about something uglier. The complaints began on Twitter. Viewers who felt the show had shifted in tone, who felt it had become less funny or less sharp, or more concerned with emotional depth than with the kind of high-concept chaos they associated with the earlier seasons, started looking for an explanation. The explanation they landed on was the new writers, more specifically, the gender of the new writers. The argument, such as it was, ran along a familiar track. The show had been good when men wrote it. The show had changed. Women now wrote it. Therefore, the women had ruined it. This logic ignored several things. It ignored that season 3 was receiving the best reviews of the show's run. It ignored that the specific episodes being praised were largely the ones shaped by the new writers. It ignored that the episode these fans most often cited as proof of the season's quality, Pickle Rick, was written by one of the women they were targeting. But logic was not the point. The point was finding someone to blame, and the new writers were visible and available. What happened next moved from unpleasant into genuinely dangerous territory. Fans on 4chan took the personal information of the female writers and published it online. This is called doxing, and its purpose is not commentary or criticism. Its purpose is to make people afraid, to give strangers
users enough information, a home address, a phone number, a workplace, to locate and confront someone in the real world. It is designed to function as a threat, even when no explicit threat is made. The message it sends is that we know where you are and we can reach you, and that message is intended to make the target feel unsafe. The writers received hate mail, they received threats. The harassment was sustained and coordinated, organized across platforms, with people sharing information and encouraging each other to make the target's lives as difficult as possible. All of this was directed at women who had done nothing except write for a television show and, in at least one case, write one of its most celebrated episodes. Dan Harmon responded publicly, and he did not soften his language. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly, he said he loathed the people doing this. He said they were knobs. He described the behavior as disgusting and said it represented a testosterone-based subculture patting itself on the back for targeting women. He made the argument that these fans believed they owned the show, that they felt an entitlement to its direction and its content that they were now weaponizing against the people who made it. He said that when a show becomes popular enough, some bad people will like it too, and that this was the visible result of that reality. Roiland also commented publicly, though less extensively. Both creators were clear that the harassment was not something they condoned or considered a legitimate form of audience feedback. The show itself, in the back half of season 3, seemed aware of what was happening in its own fandom. An episode set in a Mad Max-style post-apocalyptic world gave Summer a prominent and capable role. The finale addressed Beth's agency and independence in ways that felt deliberately counter to the idea that strong female characters had no place in the show. Whether this was a direct response to the harassment or simply the natural direction the writing was going is something only the writer's room could fully answer, but the timing was notable. What made this moment particularly complicated was the question of where it came from. The Rick and Morty fandom had developed, over the course of the show's run, a specific relationship with one of its main characters that created a particular kind of problem. Rick Sanchez, as a character, is brilliant and nihilistic and contemptuous of social norms and consequences. He does what he wants, he says what he thinks, he operates outside the rules that bind everyone else, and suffers no lasting punishment for it. The show presents this as tragedy at its most honest moments. Rick's contempt for everything, including the people he loves, is framed in the show's deeper episodes as a wound rather than a superpower. His nihilism is the armor of someone who has been hurt, not the philosophy of someone who has figured something out. A significant portion of the fandom did not read it that way. They read Rick as aspirational. They identified with his intelligence and his refusal to be accountable, and his sense that he was simply operating on a higher level than the people around him. They saw the show as validating that worldview rather than interrogating it. And when the show in season 3 began doing things that felt to them like it was not playing by the rules they had decided the show followed, they responded the way people respond when they feel something they feel entitled to is being taken from them. Harmon understood this, at least partially. He made the point in interviews that Rick is not supposed to be the hero of the show in the way the toxic segment of the fandom had decided he was. Rick's intelligence does not make his behavior acceptable. The show knows this. The show says this repeatedly in different ways across multiple seasons. The season 3 therapist scene, in which a psychiatrist calmly explains to Rick exactly what his behavior reveals about his psychology, is one of the most direct examples. Rick has no answer for her because she is right. The show is not on Rick's side in that moment. It is on the therapist's side. But a character can only control what it does on screen. It cannot control how an audience decides to receive it. And the audience that had decided Rick was the point, that his worldness was the show's actual worldview rather than its most examined flaw, was not going to be talked out of that by the writer's room. The doxing and harassment of season 3 revealed something that went beyond Rick and Morty specifically. It was an early and very visible example of a pattern that would appear repeatedly in online fan communities over the following years. The pattern of a vocal minority of fans treating a piece of popular culture as their personal property, becoming hostile toward the people who made it when the work evolved in directions they did not approve of, and using the tools of the internet to make that hostility feel like a physical threat. This pattern had been seen before in gaming communities. It would be seen again elsewhere. Rick and Morty's fandom was one of its clearest early demonstrations in adult animation. Adult Swim, as a network, was in an uncomfortable position throughout this. The harassment was not happening on their platforms. They had not created the conditions that produced it, at least not directly. But the institutional culture
culture of the network, the documented absence of female voices in its development pipeline, the remarks from senior figures about women in comedy, had contributed to an environment in which female writers on a flagship show could be framed by angry fans as intruders rather than contributors. The network's response to the harassment was muted at best. The female writers continued working on the show through season 3 and beyond. Jessica Gao went on to create her own series. Jane Becker remained involved with Rick and Morty through later seasons. The harassment did not achieve what it was designed to achieve. The writers did not leave. The show did not revert to an all-male staff. The Emmy sat on a shelf with Jessica Gao's name on it. But the conversation that moment forced into the open did not fully go away either. The question of who Rick and Morty was for, who felt entitled to it, and what that entitlement could make people do in its name stayed in the background of the show's cultural identity. Harmon talked about it in subsequent interviews. Critics referenced it when discussing the fandom. The show had become, at least in part, a story about its own audience. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The harassment of the show's own writers was one kind of fandom story, contained mostly to online spaces and the people directly targeted. What happened next spilled out into the physical world entirely, in parking lots and fast food restaurants across America, with police involved and a major corporation left apologizing. Section 5. The Szechuan Sauce Chaos. There is something almost perfectly constructed about the Szechuan sauce story. It has all the elements of a parable about internet culture and consumer behavior and the strange power a piece of popular media can have over large groups of people. It starts with a joke inside a cartoon. It moves through a corporate marketing decision made without nearly enough planning. It ends with police being called to fast food restaurants and a major international company issuing a public apology to the fans of an animated television show. Every step of it feels slightly unreal, and yet every step of it actually happened. To understand how a dipping sauce caused a near riot, it helps to start with where the joke came from. The season 3 premiere of Rick and Morty aired on April 1st, 2017, dropped without announcement as part of Adult Swim's annual April Fool's broadcast. The episode, called The Rick Shank Rickdemption, opened with a memory sequence. Rick, being probed by a Galactic Federation agent trying to extract the formula for interdimensional travel from his brain, manufactures a fake memory to mislead the agent. The fake memory is set in 1998. In it, Rick is a simpler, more domestic version of himself, and in the memory, he becomes absolutely transfixed by a dipping sauce that McDonald's had released that year as a promotional tie-in for the Disney animated film Mulan. Szechuan sauce, a limited edition condiment that had existed briefly in 1998, disappeared when the promotion ended and been largely forgotten by anyone who was not specifically nostalgic for it. Rick, in the episode, becomes obsessed with the sauce. He describes wanting to get more of it. The joke, in context, is partly about the absurdity of attaching enormous emotional significance to something trivial, which is the kind of layered commentary the show did well. On the surface, it is Rick being passionate about a dipping sauce. Underneath it, the episode is using that passion to say something about how people construct meaning around small, commercial things, and how that meaning can become genuinely powerful even when the object of it is inherently meaningless. The audience received the joke enthusiastically. Too enthusiastically, as it turned out. Within days of the episode airing, the conversation online had shifted from the episode's actual content, which was rich and significant, to the sauce. Fans wanted the sauce. They wanted McDonald's to bring it back. They wanted to taste the thing Rick had declared his white whale. A petition circulated. Social media posts accumulated. The noise around Szechuan sauce became impossible to ignore for anyone monitoring what Rick and Morty fans were talking about. McDonald's noticed. Of course McDonald's noticed. Rick and Morty was one of the most talked about shows in its demographic, and its fan base was vocal and organized and extremely active online. The idea of connecting the McDonald's brand to that energy was, from a marketing perspective, immediately appealing. The question was how to do it. What McDonald's did was announce a limited promotional release of Szechuan sauce on October 7th, 2017. The promotion was framed as a response to fan demand. The sauce would be available at participating locations for one day in limited quantities while supplies lasted. The phrase, "while supplies lasted," was doing an enormous amount of work in that announcement, and it was not doing nearly enough. The quantities that McDonald's prepared were, by almost every account, grossly inadequate for the level of demand the promotion had generated. Reports afterwards suggested that some locations received as few as 20 packets of sauce. Some received slightly more. None received anything close to what would have been needed to serve the crowds
fans that showed up. And the crowds were extraordinary. At a McDonald's location on La Brea Avenue in Los Angeles, fans began lining up the night before the promotion. By the time the location opened on October 7th, hundreds of people were waiting. They were wearing Rick and Morty merchandise. They were chanting. When it became clear that the location did not have enough sauce to serve the crowd, the chanting got louder and the mood shifted. People began pushing and shoving at the entrance. Physical altercations broke out. The Los Angeles Police Department was called to manage the crowd. Video footage from inside and outside the restaurant showed employees visibly distressed and fans behaving in ways that went well beyond ordinary consumer disappointment. Los Angeles was not the only city where things went wrong. McDonald's locations in Florida and the San Francisco Bay Area experienced their own versions of the same chaos. Crowds that had been given no realistic expectation of limited supply turned hostile when the reality of that limitation became clear. In some locations, employees were verbally abused. In others, fans demanded explanations that the staff genuinely did not have, because the staff had been given no better preparation for the day than the customers had. Justin Roiland posted on Twitter during the aftermath. He said he was not happy with how McDonald's had handled the situation. He asked fans to be kind to the employees, noting that what had happened was not their fault. It was a reasonable and decent response, and it was also a reminder that neither Adult Swim nor the show's creators had any involvement in the promotion itself. McDonald's had built this event around the Rick and Morty brand without meaningful coordination with the people who owned that brand, and the result had been a public relations disaster. McDonald's issued an apology on Twitter on October 8th. The company acknowledged that it had not anticipated the level of demand, that the limited supply had been a mistake, and that it would bring the sauce back in larger quantities at more locations. The apology was received with a mixture of relief and continued frustration from fans who had traveled significant distances and waited for hours and come away with nothing. The sauce was eventually brought back in February 2018, this time with substantially higher supply and wider availability. It was also brought back again in March 2022 as an app-exclusive promotion. The joke from a cartoon had become a recurring product line for one of the largest fast food companies on Earth. There are a few things worth sitting with in this story, beyond the surface spectacle of a sauce-based near riot. The first is what it revealed about the specific texture of the Rick and Morty fandom at that moment in time. This was October 2017, which means it was happening during the same season in which a segment of the fandom had been harassing and doxing the show's female writers. The two events were not connected in any direct way. The people who showed up to McDonald's were not, as a group, the same people who had sent threatening messages to Jessica Gao and Jane Becker, but they were drawing from the same cultural well, the same intensity of investment in the show, the same tendency to translate that investment into behavior that spilled outside the normal boundaries of fan engagement. Rick and Morty had created, or perhaps more accurately, had attracted, a fandom that felt things about the show with unusual force. When that force was directed inward, toward analysis and creativity and community, it produced something genuinely interesting. When it was directed outward, toward the people who made the show, or toward a corporate entity that had miscalculated a promotional event, it produced something considerably less appealing. The second thing worth noting is what the sauce incident said about the relationship between popular culture and consumer behavior. McDonald's had identified an opportunity and moved on it without thinking carefully enough about what they were actually dealing with. The Rick and Morty fan base was not a typical promotional audience. It was a group of people who had been primed by the show itself to treat the sauce as something significant. The show had framed Rick's obsession with the sauce as a kind of pure, almost noble desire, something real in a world of simulation and compromise. The fans had absorbed that framing and applied it to their own relationship with the product. They were not, at some level, just waiting in line for a dipping sauce. They were participating in something that felt, to them, like an extension of the show itself, like a chance to be part of the Rick and Morty universe in a physical way. McDonald's had offered them that chance, and then failed to deliver on it, and the disappointment was proportionally enormous, because the expectation had been built on something much larger than a condiment. This is not an excuse for the behavior. Pushing and shoving and verbally abusing restaurant employees over a sauce packet is not behavior that any framing can fully justify. But it is an explanation for why something so apparently trivial produced such a strong reaction. The sauce was never just the sauce. It was a proxy for the feeling of belonging to something. And when that proxy was taken away by inadequate supply and poor planning, the feeling that was lost felt more significant than the product itself. Roiland's response, asking fans to be kind to the employees, was the right note to strike. It acknowledged that something had gone wrong without amplifying it. Harmon was quieter on the subject. project, which was consistent with his general pattern of letting Roiland handle the direct fan-facing moments while he focused on the creative side. Adult Swim's official statement was crisp and distancing. The network noted that the Sauce promotion had not been organized by them or by anyone officially connected to the show. This was true and also a little convenient. The show's brand had been central to what McDonald's was selling.
The idea that Adult Swim bore no responsibility for how that brand had been used was a legal position more than an honest one, and most people paying attention recognized it as such. The wider cultural conversation that the Sauce incident produced was, in some ways, more interesting than the incident itself. It became a reference point in discussions about fandom psychology, about the ethics of fan entitlement, about the way popular media creates communities that can turn tribal very quickly when something they feel ownership over is mishandled. Writers and critics used it as an example for months afterward. Academic articles referenced it when discussing parasocial relationships and the boundaries between audience and product. The show itself, characteristically, did not ignore what had happened. Later episodes included moments that could be read as commentary on the fandom's relationship to Rick and Morty, on the way the show's audience had sometimes mistaken Rick's perspective for the show's perspective. Whether the creators intended these as direct responses to the Sauce incident and the harassment of the writers, or as broader observations about their audience, is not something the public record definitively settles. But the show was aware of itself and its audience in ways that few animated series had ever been, and it is difficult to believe that events as visible as these had no effect on what ended up on screen. McDonald's, in the end, came out of it relatively unscathed. The sauce was brought back, the supply was adequate, the fans got what they had wanted, and the company had generated an enormous amount of press coverage, most of it ultimately positive, from a promotion that had initially looked like a disaster. There is something almost admirable in how cleanly they recovered, though admirable is perhaps not quite the right word for a corporation that caused a near riot and then apologized its way back to good standing. The fans who had pushed and shoved and chanted and driven across state lines for a packet of sauce mostly faded back into their ordinary lives. A few of them appeared in news coverage, interviewed outside the restaurants on the day of the promotion, expressions ranging from genuine excitement to visible fury. Most of them were young. Most of them seemed, in those interview clips, to be people who genuinely loved the show and had genuinely wanted to be part of something. They had just expressed that want in a way that got away from them. Rick and Morty kept airing, the fandom kept growing, the creators kept making the show in the complicated, strained way that the show was actually being made, and the sauce became a footnote to a larger story that was still, at that point, unfolding in directions nobody outside a small circle of people had any idea about. The chaos in the parking lots had been visible and loud and easy to film. What was coming next had been building in private for years, and it would eventually be much harder to look at. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Sauce incident put the fandom on the front page and made the show's name synonymous with a particular kind of fan excess. Coming up, the show's other co-creator had his own reckoning waiting, one that had nothing to do with Roiland and everything to do with something Harmon himself had made years before anyone had heard of Rick and Morty. Section 6. Dan Harmon's own reckoning. There is a particular kind of past that does not stay buried. It sits quietly for years, sometimes decades, in corners of the internet that most people never visit. And then, usually at the worst possible moment, usually when the person it belongs to is most visible and most successful, something pulls it back into the light. For Dan Harmon, that moment came in the summer of 2018, when Rick and Morty was at the height of its cultural dominance, and his name was attached to one of the most celebrated animated series on television. What surfaced was a video, not a recent one, not something made in the heat of his fame or in the context of the show that had made him a household name in animation. It was a short film from 2009, made nearly a decade earlier, produced for Channel 101, the same festival where he had first encountered Justin Roiland. The festival that prided itself on total creative freedom and no gatekeepers, and the understanding that taboo content was part of what the space was for. The short was called Daryl. It was a parody of the Showtime drama Dexter, a show built around a serial killer who targets other criminals. In Daryl, Harmon played a therapist treating a new father. The premise followed the Dexter template in the loosest possible sense. What Harmon actually did in the video went considerably further than parody. In the short, his character drugs a patient, climbs through a window, and performs simulated sexual acts on a baby represented by a plastic doll. The acts are graphic in their staging. They are repeated more than once. The film was not subtle about what it was depicting. Harmon had recognized almost immediately
immediately after making it that it had gone too far. He pulled the video from public circulation himself,
not long after it first aired at the festival. By 2012, it had been quietly removed from the Channel 101 website without explanation. He had taken it down, and apparently hoped that would be enough. For 9 years, it mostly was. The video resurfaced in July 2018. It did not resurface through journalism, or through any kind of organized investigation into Harmon's past. It resurfaced through 4chan, the same anonymous internet forum that had been involved in the doxing of the Rick and Morty female writers the previous year. And it did not resurface randomly. It resurfaced as deliberate retaliation. The specific context matters here. In the summer of 2018, Disney had fired James Gunn, the director of Guardians of the Galaxy, after a coordinated campaign surfaced old tweets in which Gunn had made jokes about rape and child abuse. The campaign against Gunn had been organized by figures on the far right who were unhappy with his public criticism of Donald Trump. The logic, stated openly by those involved, was a kind of cultural tit for tat. If left-leaning celebrities could end the careers of right-leaning figures for offensive speech, then right-leaning internet communities could do the same in reverse. Harmon had been a vocal critic of Trump. He was a visible figure in what certain online communities considered the enemy's cultural camp. The Daryl video was found, or had already been known about, and was shared on 4chan, and then on a far-right subreddit called The Donald, with the explicit framing that if Roseanne Barr's career could be damaged for racist tweets, Harmon's career could be damaged for this video. The motivation was not genuine outrage at the content. The motivation was political and retaliatory, and the people sharing it said so openly. None of which made the content of the video acceptable. The political motivation of those who surfaced it did not change what was in it. Harmon understood this, and his response reflected it. He did not fight the story. He did not claim the video had been taken out of context, or that people were misreading it, or that the political motivation of those who found it somehow invalidated the concern. He issued a statement the same day the video began circulating widely. The statement was direct. He said that in 2009, he had made a pilot that had only succeeded in offending. He said he had recognized immediately that the content was too distasteful and had taken it down himself. He said that nobody should ever have to see what was in it, and that he was sincerely sorry. Then, he deleted his Twitter account, which had over 670,000 followers at the time. Adult Swim responded with a statement of its own. The network said that the content of the video demonstrated poor judgment and did not reflect the type of content they sought out. They acknowledged that Harmon had recognized his mistake at the time and had apologized, and that he understood there was no place for that kind of content at the network. The statement was carefully worded to be critical of the video, while stopping short of suggesting any professional consequences for Harmon. This is where a comparison becomes unavoidable, and it is a comparison that became significantly more pointed after everything that happened with Roiland in 2023. When Harmon's video surfaced, Adult Swim issued a statement within days, noted that he had already acknowledged the mistake and kept him on the show. His name remained in the credits. His role as showrunner was unaffected. The apology was accepted, and the professional relationship continued without interruption. When Roiland's charges became public in January 2023, Adult Swim issued a single line. The line read, in its entirety, that Adult Swim had ended its association with Justin Roiland. No context, no acknowledgement of the specific circumstances, no reference to the charges being, at that point, still unresolved. Just a clean, final termination. The difference in how the two men were treated has been noted by people who followed both stories. Some argued the situations were not comparable, that Harmon's video was a past creative mistake that he had addressed immediately, while Roiland's situation involved criminal charges and a pattern of behavior that went well beyond a single poor judgment call. Others argued that the disparity reflected something about which creator Adult Swim considered more essential to the show's continued operation. Harmon was the showrunner. The writer's room was his. Losing him would have been significantly more disruptive to production than losing Roiland, whose creative involvement had, by that point, already diminished considerably. Both of those readings have merit, and they are not mutually exclusive. What the Harmon situation added to the show's history was a second layer of complicated biography around its creators. Rick and Morty was already carrying the weight of the fandom harassment stories, the production delays, the quietly dissolving partnership between its two co-creators. Now it was also carrying the knowledge that one of those creators had made something deeply disturbing and had kept it out of public view for nearly a decade, and that the circumstances under which it finally became public had less to do with accountability than with political warfare. There was also a second Harmon controversy that surfaced around the same time, one that had a different character and arguably a more direct relevance to how the professional world should think about him. Megan Gans had been a writer on Community, the NBC sitcom Harmon had created and run before Rick and Morty. In January 2018, 6 months before the Daryl video resurfaced, Gans posted a series of tweets describing her experience working under Harmon. She described him as having developed feelings for her, then acting on those feelings in ways that created an uncomfortable dynamic, then turning hostile when she did not respond the way he wanted. She described the experience of working in that environment as damaging. She said her memory of that period was not something she could forget. And she said this in direct response to a tweet from Harmon in which he had mentioned that his memory of certain things was foggy. Harmon responded publicly and at length. He did not deny what she described. He said he had developed a crush on her, that he had expressed it in ways that made her uncomfortable, that when she did not return his feelings, he had treated her badly in ways he was ashamed of. He described his own behavior as abuse of his position as her boss. He said he had spent years trying to avoid thinking about it, because thinking about it was painful, and that this avoidance had been selfish and wrong. He apologized directly and specifically. It was, by most accounts, one of the more complete public apologies to come out of the wave of accountability that defined that period in the entertainment industry. Gans herself acknowledged it as such, saying on Twitter that it was the apology she had hoped for, and that she felt heard. The exchange became something of a reference point in conversations about what genuine accountability could look like, as distinct from the deflections and non-apologies that characterized many similar moments. But accountability and consequence are different things. Harmon kept his job. He kept his role on Rick and Morty. He kept his position as one of the most powerful figures in adult animation. The apology was real, and it was accepted, and the professional world moved on from it fairly quickly. This is not necessarily the wrong outcome. People who acknowledge their behavior, who do not minimize it, who offer genuine apologies to the people they harmed, are generally considered to have done what can be done. Gans's own response suggested she felt the acknowledgement had value, but the contrast with how other situations in the same industry were handled remained visible. What both of these Harmon stories share is a quality of things that existed in the background of Rick and Morty's public life without ever fully becoming part of how the show was discussed. The Daryl video was known about by certain corners of the internet long before it went mainstream. The community writers' room dynamic had been something of an open secret in certain professional circles before Gans put it into words publicly. Neither thing had prevented Harmon from continuing to work, from continuing to build, from continuing to receive the credit and praise that Rick and Morty was generating in considerable quantities. The show continued through both moments largely undisturbed. Season 3 had aired. Season 4 was being planned. The writers' room kept working. The animation pipeline kept moving. Whatever personal reckoning Harmon was undergoing in private, the professional machine kept producing episodes. There is something worth noting in how Harmon processed these moments publicly. He was, in both cases, more honest than most people in his position tend to be. He did not hire lawyers to craft statements designed to minimize legal liability while appearing remorseful. He did not wait for the news cycle to move on and then quietly resume business as usual without addressing anything. He said what he had done, named it clearly, and expressed regret in terms that felt specific rather than generic. Whether that honesty was accompanied by genuine internal change is something only the people who worked with him afterward could assess. What is visible from the outside is that he made no further public statements about either situation after the initial responses, and that his professional life continued largely as before. Rick and Morty's audience absorbed these revelations with varying degrees of concern. Some fans felt the Daryl video was disqualifying and said so loudly. Others accepted the apology at face value and moved on. Many simply continued watching the show, without much engagement with the biographical complexity behind it. Popular culture has a remarkable capacity to absorb uncomfortable information about its creators without fundamentally changing how audiences relate to the work, and Rick and Morty demonstrated that capacity thoroughly. What none of the audience knew through all of this was that the Harmon stories, significant as they were not the most serious thing developing in the background of the show they loved. While Harmon was navigating his public reckonings and the fandom was processing what it meant to have a creator with this kind of history, something was happening in the private life of the other creator. Something that had already occurred by the time either of the Harmon controversies became public. Something that had been known to law enforcement and to the legal system for years before it became known to anyone watching the show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Dan Harmon's past had surfaced, been addressed, and been largely absorbed without derailing the show. What was coming next could not be absorbed so cleanly because it had not happened in 2009, and it had not been addressed immediately, and it had not been taken down from a website before most people saw it. Next, the charges nobody knew about. Section 7. The charges nobody knew about. There is something disorienting about learning that a significant legal event involving a famous person happened years before anyone told you about it. The instinct is to ask how. How does something like that stay contained? maintained? How do criminal charges against one of the most recognizable names in adult animation remain outside the public conversation for over 2 years, while the person in question continues to appear in promotional materials, continues to voice characters that millions of people watch every week, continues to be treated by every institutional structure around him as though nothing has changed? The answer, as it usually is with these things, is a combination of legal process, institutional silence, and a media environment that did not yet have the information it needed to report. Justin Roiland was arrested in August 2020. The charge was felony domestic battery with corporal injury. There was a second charge alongside it, felony false imprisonment by menace, violence, fraud, or deceit. The incident that produced these charges had occurred in January 2020, 7 months before the arrest. The person involved was an unnamed woman, referred to in the legal documents as Jane Doe, who had been in a relationship with Roiland at the time of the alleged incident. Roiland was released on a $50,000 bail after pleading not guilty. A pretrial hearing was scheduled, and the case began its slow movement through the Orange County court system. None of this was reported publicly at the time. This is the part of the story that requires some care to explain, because the absence of reporting is not the same as a cover-up in the institutional sense. There are legitimate structural reasons why criminal charges at the pretrial stage do not always generate immediate press coverage. Felony charges are filed regularly against many people. Not all of them become news. The decision about which charges are newsworthy enough to report involves judgments about public interest, about the prominence of the person involved, about the availability of verified information. Courts in California do not automatically alert journalists when charges are filed. Someone has to be paying attention, has to be looking at the right documents, has to connect the name in the legal record to the public figure. For over 2 years, that connection was not made publicly. The case moved through its pretrial stages. Hearings were scheduled and continued and rescheduled. The process was slow, which is not unusual for felony cases in a system that is chronically overloaded. Roiland's attorney maintained throughout that his client was innocent and that the case was on course to be dismissed once prosecutors completed their review of the evidence. During those 2 years, Rick and Morty aired. Season 5 premiered in June 2021 and ran through September of that year. Season 6 premiered in September 2022 and ran through November. Promotional cycles happened, trailers were released, Roiland gave interviews, he appeared at events, he was active on social media. He continued to voice Rick and Morty in recording sessions that presumably required him to be present and functional in a professional environment. The institutional structures around him, Adult Swim, his management, his legal representation, operated on the assumption that the case would resolve quietly. This is not a cynical assumption. It is how most pretrial situations play out for defendants with resources and representation. The charges would either be dismissed or dealt with in some way that did not require the public world to rearrange itself around them. The strategy, whether explicitly chosen or simply defaulted into, was to wait it out. Meanwhile, the behind-the-scenes picture of Roiland's professional life during this period was considerably more complicated than what any external observer could see. Reports that emerged later painted a picture of someone whose behavior at work had been deteriorating for some time before the arrest. The pattern described was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual withdrawal. He was harder to reach. He was less present. He showed up to some things and not to others. When he did show up, he was not always in a condition that made productive work easy. A specific story from this period involves the animated series Koala Man, which Roiland was executive producing for Hulu. The show had a character that Roiland was supposed to voice. He delayed recording the part repeatedly, to the point where the production schedule was genuinely threatened. The writers and producers, unable to plan around him, eventually made a creative decision that addressed the problem directly. They wrote the character out of the show, killing the role off within the episode, so that Roiland's absence became a story choice rather than a production failure. It was a practical solution to an impractical situation. And the fact that it was necessary at all said something about how reliable he had become as a collaborator. On Solar Opposites, the Hulu animated series he had co-created with Mike McMahon, similar patterns were reported. He was the voice of the main character, Corvo, and his presence in the recording booth was necessary for the show to function. The recording sessions happened, but the surrounding creative involvement that a co-creator might be expected to provide was increasingly absent. McMahon and the writers' room were effectively running the show. Roiland's contribution had narrowed to the performances themselves. At Rick and Morty, the situation was much the same, and had been for longer. Harmon's writers' room was making the creative decisions. Roiland was providing the voices. The arrangement worked in the sense that episodes were getting made and released, but it was an arrangement that had less to do with genuine co-creation, and more to do with Roiland filling the specific role that only he could fill, the voices, while the rest of the show moved around him. What the people who worked with him during this period observed, and what was reported later by multiple sources, was that his behavior had qualities that alarmed those around him. He would arrive to professional obligations in states that made people uncomfortable. He would at times not arrive at all. He had a reputation, described in various accounts, for being treated as an eccentric genius whose erratic behavior was simply part of the package. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in industries that prize talent above other considerations. When someone is considered irreplaceable, the people around them tend to develop a tolerance for behavior they would not accept from anyone else. The behavior escalates because the consequences never materialize. The tolerance deepens because confrontation feels too risky. This is not a phenomenon unique to entertainment, but entertainment, with its premium on individual creative talent and its tendency to concentrate enormous resources around specific names and voices and faces, is particularly susceptible to it. And Rick and Morty, whose entire sound was built on two characters whose voices were Roiland and Roiland alone, was an environment where the leverage that talent provided was as high as it gets. The charges filed in 2020 were known to some people in his professional circle. How widely they were known and what decisions were made based on that knowledge is not something the public record fully clarifies. What is clear is that the institutional response, to the extent there was one, was not to act immediately and visibly. Adult Swim did not terminate his contract when the charges were filed. Hulu did not remove him from his shows. His management did not release a statement. The legal process was allowed to proceed on its own timeline while the professional world maintained its existing arrangements. This is the part of the story where the word cover-up becomes genuinely applicable, even if the specific form it took was passive rather than active. Nobody organized a campaign to suppress the information. Nobody pressured journalists to stay silent. The information simply existed in a legal system that had not yet made it public, in a professional environment that had strong financial incentives not to surface it, and in a personal circle that presumably understood what disclosure would mean for the projects and the money attached to them. NBC News broke the story in January 2023. The timing was not random. A pre-trial hearing had been scheduled for January 13th, 2023, which meant Roiland was required to appear in court on a specific date that was now part of the public record. A journalist or team of journalists at NBC had found the case in the court filings, had connected the name to the public figure, and had done the reporting necessary to publish it. The story ran on January 12th, 2023, the day before the hearing. The speed of what followed was striking. Adult Swim issued its one-line termination statement within days. Hulu and 20th Television Animation followed within 24 hours, cutting ties with Roiland across Solar Opposites and Koala Man simultaneously. Squanch Games, the video game studio Roiland had co-founded, announced that he had already resigned as of January 16th. The entire professional infrastructure that had been built around him collapsed in the space of roughly 2 weeks. The charges themselves were eventually dismissed in March 2023. The Orange County District Attorney's Office cited insufficient evidence. Roiland's attorney released a statement saying his client was determined to move forward and restore his good name. The legal conclusion was, in the narrow technical sense, in Roiland's favor, but the dismissal of the charges did not restore anything. The professional relationships were already severed. The voice roles had already been designated for recasting. The shows had already announced they would continue without him. A legal outcome of insufficient evidence is not the same as a verdict of innocence, and the institutions that had cut ties with him showed no indication of revisiting those decisions based on the dismissal. Then, in September 2023, NBC News published a second report. This one contained allegations that went beyond the domestic violence charges that had already been dismissed. Nearly a dozen women and non-binary people came forward to describe experiences with Roiland that included sexual assault and direct online communication with underage girls. The allegations described a pattern of behavior that had reportedly been occurring since at least 2013, the same year Rick and Morty premiered. Some of the communications cited in the report involved Roiland using his status and fame to initiate contact with young fans, some of whom were minors. One specific incident from 2019 received particular attention. NBC News reported that Roiland had been in Boston for a gaming convention when he made contact with a young woman through the dating app Tinder. The conversation that followed was described as sexually explicit and inappropriate. The woman was 20 years old at the time. Reports also described a resurfaced podcast appearance in which Roiland had made comments about underage girls that were deeply uncomfortable. In isolation, and significantly more disturbing in the context of the later counter allegations. Roiland's attorney responded to the September 2023 report by calling the allegations false and defamatory. No additional criminal charges were filed in connection with the new allegations as of the time that reporting was published. Dan Harmon spoke publicly in September 2023 in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, conducted before the second NBC News report was published. He said he was frustrated, ashamed, and heartbroken. He said that hard work and joy and passion had been leveraged to exploit and harm strangers, which was a careful way of describing what the allegations suggested had happened. He said that the easiest thing to say about Roiland had been nothing, because Roiland had isolated well, by which Harmon seemed to mean that the behavior had been kept sufficiently separate from the shared professional space that Harmon had not seen it directly. He also described the end of their friendship. He said there were parts of the story he could not tell because Roiland was no longer there to give his version. He said he still did not fully understand why the friendship had ended, which is a remarkable thing to say about someone you had spent years building something with. Whether that lack of understanding was genuine or diplomatic or some combination of both is impossible to know from the outside. What Harmon did not say, in that interview or anywhere else publicly, was that he had known about the 2020 charges before they became public. Whether he did know, and what he thought or did with that knowledge, if he did, remains part of the story that has not been fully told. The fan base, confronted with the September 2023 allegations, processed them in the fragmented and uneven way that online communities tend to process difficult information. Some fans declared they could no longer watch the show. Others argued that the work should be separated from the person who had contributed to making it. Others focused on the fact that the criminal charges had been dismissed and treated that dismissal as more exonerating than it legally was. The conversation was loud and inconclusive and continues in various forms to this day. What the charges, and the manner in which they stayed hidden for so long, revealed most clearly was the gap between how institutions present themselves and how they actually function. Adult Swim had a reputation for edginess and creative freedom, and a certain kind of outlaw sensibility. It presented itself as different from the sanitized corporate entertainment world it existed alongside. But when one of its most valuable creators was arrested on felony charges, the institutional response was the same as it would have been anywhere else. Protect the asset, let the legal process run, make no public moves that are not forced by external pressure. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The charges had been filed in 2020 and kept out of public view until a court date made silence impossible. Once the story broke, everything that had been held in place for years collapsed within days. Next, the firing and everything that fell with it. Section 8, the firing and the fallout. January 2023 is the month that everything that had been quietly accumulating behind the scenes of Rick and Morty became impossible to contain. The NBC News report ran. The court date was public record. The name Justin Roiland was now attached in every major publication and on every major platform to the words felony domestic violence. The careful silence that it held for 2.5 years was over in a single news cycle, and what followed moved with a speed that suggested the institutions involved had been preparing for exactly this moment, even if they had hoped it would never arrive. The first public move came from Adult Swim. On January 24th, 2023, the network posted a statement on its Instagram account. The statement was one sentence. It read that Adult Swim had ended its association with Justin Roiland. Nothing else. No acknowledgement of the charges, no reference to the show's future, no expression of concern for anyone involved, no context of any kind, just a clean, flat declaration that the relationship was over, delivered in the most minimal possible language and placed on a social media platform rather than issued through a formal press release. The brevity of that statement was itself a kind of statement. It communicated that Adult Swim had no interest in discussing this further than it absolutely had to. It communicated that the decision had been made and was not subject to elaboration or debate. It communicated, perhaps most importantly, that the network was moving on and expected everyone else to do the same. For an institution that had spent years building its identity around a show whose entire creative and vocal identity was bound up in one person, the response was strikingly impersonal. The fan base received the statement with the mixture of shock and urgency that accompanies any major piece of unexpected news about something people care deeply about. The immediate questions were practical. Who would voice Rick and Morty? Whether the show would continue? What the 70-episode deal meant now that one of the two people who had negotiated it was no longer part of the production? Whether anything that had already been recorded would be affected? Whether seasons that were in progress would be delayed? Adult Swim did not answer most of these questions immediately. The network confirmed that Rick
Rick and Morty would continue. It confirmed that the voice roles would be recast. It did not name replacement voice actors,
a decision that was deliberate and that some interpreted as an attempt to manage the announcement in stages rather than overwhelming the news cycle with too many simultaneous revelations. Hulu moved the following day. On January 25, 2023, 20th Television Animation and Hulu Originals issued a joint statement that mirrored Adult Swim's in its economy of language. "We have ended our association with Justin Roiland. The same construction, the same absence of elaboration. Solar Opposites would continue without him. Koala Man would continue without him. The overall deal Roiland had held with 20th Television Animation, which had provided the institutional framework for his involvement across multiple Hulu projects, was terminated." Dan Stevens, known to most audiences from his role in Downton Abbey and various film projects, was announced as the replacement voice for Corvo in Solar Opposites. The casting was notable for bringing in a recognizable name rather than an unknown voice actor, which suggested the production was treating the transition as something significant enough to warrant a visible choice rather than a quiet substitution. Squanch Games had moved even before the Adult Swim announcement. The video game studio that Roiland had co-founded posted on January 24th that he had resigned from the company effective January 16th, meaning he had already left before the public terminations from the networks were announced. The timeline suggested that the events of January 2023 had not been entirely spontaneous. Decisions had been made and implemented before the public statements appeared, and the sequencing, Squanch on the 16th, Adult Swim on the 24th, Hulu on the 25th, suggested a coordinated unwinding of Roiland's professional life rather than a chaotic reaction to breaking news. Roiland's attorney maintained throughout these days that his client was innocent and that the case was proceeding toward dismissal. The legal argument was that the evidence did not support the charges and that the district attorney's office would reach that conclusion upon completing its review. This turned out to be accurate in the narrow legal sense. In March 2023, the charges were dismissed by the Orange County District Attorney's Office due to insufficient evidence. Roiland posted on social media saying he was determined to move forward and focus on his creative projects and on restoring his good name. The dismissal changed nothing professionally. Adult Swim did not reach back out. Hulu did not reverse its decision. Squanch Games did not ask him to return. The legal outcome and the professional outcome occupied completely separate tracks, and the institutions that had terminated their relationships with him showed no interest in treating a dismissal for insufficient evidence as a reason to reconsider. Their decisions had been made on the basis of something broader than the specific criminal charges, and the resolution of those charges did not address that broader something. What made the situation more complex, and what prevented any clean narrative of exoneration from taking hold, was the nature of what else was known. The criminal charges were the most legally significant piece of the story, but they were not the only piece. The behavior that had been described by multiple people who had worked with Roiland, the disappearing from writers' rooms, the arriving to professional obligations in concerning states, the pattern of unreliability that had required a mediator to salvage his working relationship with Harmon, the Koala Man character that had to be written out because he could not be reached. All of that had existed alongside the legal situation and informed how the institutions around him processed their decisions. Then, September 2023 arrived, and the second NBC News report changed the conversation again. The new allegations, brought forward by nearly a dozen people, described behavior that went significantly beyond what the domestic violence charges had covered. Sexual assault allegations, online communications with underage girls, a pattern that was described as having roots going back to 2013. The report gave specific texture to what had previously been general. Individual accounts, individual circumstances, individual descriptions of what it had been like to be on the receiving end of behavior that the people describing it had not felt able to speak about publicly until now. The response to the September report was different in character from the response to the January one. In January, the story had been about legal charges that Roiland denied, that his attorney described as false, and that were, eventually, dismissed. There was a framework for processing that, however imperfectly. Criminal charges exist within a system with defined procedures and defined outcomes. The September report did not have that framework. It was testimony, personal accounts, the kind of evidence that is real and significant, but that does not resolve into a verdict. Roiland's attorney called the September allegations false and defamatory. No additional criminal charges were filed. The legal record remained, technically, in Roiland's favor following the March dismissal, but the court of public perception operates on different standards than a court of law, and the accumulation of named and unnamed accounts describing similar patterns of behavior had a weight that the legal outcome could not simply override. Dan Harmon's interview with The Hollywood Reporter, published in late September September 2023, shortly before the second NBC report, was the most substantive public statement he made about any of it. The interview covered the deterioration of his relationship with Roiland, the behind-the-scenes history of the show, and his emotional response to the allegations. He used the words frustrated, ashamed, and heartbroken. He said that the easiest thing had been to say nothing, and that his silence had been enabled by how effectively Roiland had kept different parts of his life separate from each other. He made one observation that stays with you. He said that a lot of hard work, joy, and passion had been leveraged to exploit and harm strangers. This is a precise and painful way to describe what the allegations suggested. The fame and the access and the cultural weight of Rick and Morty had provided a platform and a set of opportunities that had apparently been used in ways that caused harm. The show itself, the thing Harmon had spent years building and protecting and fighting for, had functioned as a vehicle for something he was deeply ashamed to be associated with. He also described, in that interview, the moment he realized the friendship with Roiland was over. The emotionally confrontational text exchange in 2019. His fear that Roiland was not going to come back from wherever he was going. His inability to finish the story of what happened because Roiland was no longer present in his life to give his side of it. These were not the words of someone performing regret. They were the words of someone genuinely trying to understand how something had fallen apart and not fully succeeding. The recasting of Rick and Morty's main characters was confirmed ahead of Season 7. Adult Swim revealed that Ian Cardone would voice Rick Sanchez, and Harry Belden would voice Morty Smith. Neither name was widely known before the announcement. They were not celebrities. They were voice actors who had been found through what was described as an extensive search process. The choice to cast unknowns rather than established names was a significant one. It suggested that Adult Swim's priority was finding voices that could be close enough to what audiences had known, rather than making a statement by attaching a recognizable name to the roles. Another quiet change accompanied the recasting. When Season 7 aired, the opening credits had been altered. Both Harmon and Roiland's names had been removed from their previous position in the credits sequence. Adult Swim never released a statement explaining this decision. No announcement was made. The names simply were not there anymore in the place they had previously appeared. Fans noticed immediately. Speculation about the reasoning ranged from a deliberate attempt to signal a new era to a legal decision related to the terms of Roiland's departure. The network did not clarify which, if either, of these explanations was correct. The credits change was perhaps the most symbolically loaded part of the entire transition. The names of the two people who had created the show, who had given it its voice in the most literal sense, had been removed from the thing they made. The show kept the title, it kept the characters, it kept the mythology and the world and the emotional architecture that had been built across 6 seasons. But the two names that had appeared at the beginning of every episode, year after year, through all the delays and the controversies and the quietly dissolving partnership, were gone. One had left under circumstances that were catastrophic and public. The other had stayed, but his name had gone with the one who left. Whether that was a legal decision, or a creative one, or simply a consequence of a contract expiring at an inconvenient moment, is not something the public record clarifies. It was simply another thing that happened without explanation, in a story that had always had more happening than anyone was willing to explain. The fallout from January 2023 did not end with the firings and the recasting and the credit changes. It continued in the conversations that spread across every platform where people talked about the show. It continued in the comment sections of Season 7 trailers, and the review scores on aggregator sites, and the subreddits where fans who had grown up with Roiland's voices tried to decide how they felt about hearing different ones. It continued in the cultural conversation about what to do with work you love when the person who made it turns out to have done things you find it hard to sit with. None of those conversations reached clean conclusions. They rarely do. What they produced instead was a fandom that had been through more in the space of a year than most fandoms encounter across a show's entire run, trying to figure out what they were still holding on to and what they were willing to let go. The show itself kept going. It had 30-something episodes left on the 70-episode order. It had been renewed beyond that. It had a new voice cast and a sole surviving credited creator, and a writer's room that had, for practical purposes, been running independently for years anyway. Whether what continued deserved to be called the same show was a question different people answered differently, and continue to answer differently, based on what they thought the show had fundamentally been. That question was about to get its first real answer, in the form of a season that aired into one of the most charged and complicated audience environments any television show had navigated in recent memory. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The firings had happened, the recasting had been announced, and the show had declared it would continue. What nobody yet knew was whether the audience would follow it into that new version.
version of itself, or whether the voices they had grown up with were so fundamental to what the show was that losing them meant losing the thing entirely. Section 9. The show that kept going. There is a specific kind of test that only television shows face. A film ends and its relationship with its audience is complete. A book is finished, and whatever the author does afterward does not change the words on the page. But a television show is ongoing. It has to keep arriving. It has to keep asking its audience to show up again, to reinvest, to care about what happens next. And when something fundamental about the show changes, something as basic and irreplaceable as the voice of its main characters, the audience has to decide in real time whether what they loved was the thing itself or the specific version of it they had known. Rick and Morty Season 7 premiered on October 15th, 2023. It arrived into one of the most complicated audience environments any animated series had faced in recent memory. The domestic violence charges had broken in January. The recasting had been confirmed over the summer. The September NBC News report with the new allegations had landed less than a month before the premiere date. The show was asking people to sit down and watch a new version of itself at the exact moment when the conversation about its co-creator was at its loudest and most disturbing. The marketing for Season 7 was careful. Adult Swim released a trailer that leaned into the show's mythology and its humor without drawing attention to the voice change directly. The trailer did not feature any commentary from the creative team about what the season meant or what the transition represented. It presented the show as continuing, as though continuation were the most natural thing in the world, as though nothing of particular significance had changed. This was a strategic choice. Drawing attention to the new voices would have invited direct comparison. Saying nothing about them forced the audience to encounter them without a frame, which was either brave or calculating, depending on how you read it. The voices were the first thing everyone noticed. Ian Cardoni's Rick and Harry Belden's Morty landed in the ears of an audience that had spent years with Justin Roiland's versions of those characters. Roiland had not just voiced them, he had, in a real sense, invented them.
The specific cadences, the particular rhythms of Rick's rambling intelligence and Morty's anxious stammering had been developed by Roiland through years of improvisation and recording and refinement. They were not just sounds, they were personalities expressed through sound, and the personalities had become inseparable from the sounds in the minds of millions of people. Cardoni and Belden had been found through what Adult Swim described as an extensive casting process. They were not celebrities. They were not people the audience had existing relationships with. They were voice actors whose primary qualification was the ability to perform these specific roles convincingly, and by most accounts, they had that ability. Cardoni's Rick was close enough to Roiland's that casual viewers might not immediately register the difference on a surface level. The gruff, slightly slurred intellectualism was there. The rhythmic pauses, the way certain words got elongated for comic effect, the underlying weariness that gave the character its emotional weight. These things were present, but close enough and the same thing are different things, and the portion of the audience that had the deepest relationship with the show knew the difference immediately. Online forums filled within hours of the premiere with detailed comparisons. Fans who had watched every episode multiple times, who had analyzed the vocal performances with a level of attention most people reserve for things that matter far more, documented every moment where Cardoni's Rick diverged from Roiland's, every slightly different inflection, every beat that landed a fraction of a second differently than they expected, every line reading that solved the problem of how to say the line in a way that was correct but not quite familiar. The review bombing began almost immediately. On aggregator sites that track audience scores, Season 7 received a wave of negative ratings in its opening days that had little to do with the quality of the episodes themselves. The ratings were a protest. They were people expressing, in the only currency available to them, their displeasure at what had happened. Some of the negative reviews explicitly referenced Roiland. Some referenced the broader situation. Some simply said the voices were wrong and left it at that. The critical reception was considerably more positive. Reviewers who evaluated the episodes as pieces of television, rather than as artifacts of a deeply complicated moment, generally found them to be strong. The writing was sharp. The stories were inventive. The emotional beats that had always distinguished the show's best moments from its more mechanical ones were still present. Critics noted that the voice transition was more seamless than many had feared, that Cardoni and Belden had done genuinely impressive work in an almost impossible situation, and that the show's underlying creative strengths had survived the change. This split between the critical reception and the audience score on aggregator sites was noted widely and became its own story. It illustrated something that had always been true about Rick and Morty's relationship with its audience, which was that the most vocal portion of the fandom had never been a reliable indicator of the show's actual quality. The same fandom that had harassed female writers and caused chaos at McDonald's and spent years treating the
gaps between seasons as personal affronts was now using review scores as a weapon. The mechanism was different, but the underlying dynamic was the same. A segment of the audience treating the show as a possession that had been taken from them, rather than a piece of creative work that belonged to the people who made it. Underneath the noise, something quieter was happening. People were actually watching the show. Season 7 pulled solid viewership numbers. Not record-breaking, not the historic highs of Season 3, but respectable numbers for a show navigating an unprecedented transition in the most public possible way. The audience that showed up was an audience that had decided, for whatever combination of reasons, to give the new version a chance. Some of them were convinced quickly. Some remained unconvinced but kept watching anyway. Some tuned in once and decided it was not for them and left. The season itself, evaluated apart from everything surrounding it, was generally considered a return to the show's more emotionally grounded mode after what some fans had felt was an uneven Season 6. Episodes explored Rick's psychology with a directness that the show had sometimes avoided in its middle seasons. The relationship between Rick and Morty was given room to develop in ways that felt earned rather than mechanical. Summer received storylines that treated her as a full character rather than a supporting presence. The writing room, which had been functioning as Harmon's writing room in practical terms for years, produced work that demonstrated the show's creative capacity had not been fundamentally damaged by the transition it had been forced to make. One thing that happened quietly during Season 7 was worth noticing. The show did not address the Roiland situation within its fiction. There was no episode that acknowledged the change in voice, no meta-commentary on what had happened, no winking reference to the real-world circumstances that had produced the new cast. Some viewers had expected the show, given its history of self-awareness about its own audience and its own mythology, to say something about what it had been through. It did not. The choice to simply continue, to present the new voices as the voices without comment, was either a sign of confidence or a deliberate avoidance, and reasonable people disagreed about which. Dan Harmon, in the months surrounding the Season 7 premiere, was relatively quiet in public. He had given the Hollywood Reporter interview in September. He had addressed the Roiland situation more directly in that interview than he had anywhere else. But he did not appear in the promotional cycle for Season 7 in any prominent way. There were no panels, no extensive press tours, no public appearances designed to build anticipation. The show's marketing existed largely without a visible human face attached to it, which was unusual for a production of its scale and profile. This absence was interpreted in various ways. Some read it as Harmon processing a genuinely difficult period privately and not feeling equipped to be the public face of a celebration of something that had cost so much. Others read it as a strategic decision by Adult Swim to let the show speak for itself rather than route attention through a creator whose own history had become complicated enough to generate its own headlines. Both readings may have been partially correct. The credit change that had removed both Harmon and Roiland's names from their traditional position in the opening sequence generated sustained discussion throughout the season. Adult Swim never explained it. Harmon never explained it. It simply existed as a fact about the show that nobody with the authority to clarify it chose to clarify. Fan theories ranged from contract explanations to deliberate erasure to a general desire to rebrand the show as something new. The truth, whatever it was, remained inside the production. Cardoni and Belden, for their part, did not give extensive public interviews about their experience during Season 7. Their names had not been officially revealed by Adult Swim at the time of the premiere, an unusual decision that some interpreted as an attempt to keep attention on the show rather than on the individuals performing the roles. Their identities became known fairly quickly regardless, because the internet does not tend to allow that kind of mystery to persist very long. But the official reticence on the subject spoke to the careful way the network was managing every element of the transition. What Season 7 ultimately demonstrated was that Rick and Morty could continue. Not that it was the same, not that the transition had been painless or seamless or welcomed by everyone who had loved what came before, but that the show had enough structural integrity, enough creative depth in its writing and its world and its emotional architecture to function without the specific voice that had defined it most audibly for a decade. Whether that was reassuring or melancholy depended entirely on what you thought the show had fundamentally been about. If the show was about Justin Roiland's voice and the specific improvisational quality that voice brought to two characters he had invented in a crude short film in 2006, then what continued after Season 6 was something related to Rick and Morty but not quite Rick and Morty itself, a continuation that honored the original without being able to fully reproduce it. If the show was about Dan Harmon's story structure and the writing room's capacity to generate emotionally resonant science fiction and the world that had been built across years of careful mythology, then Season 7 was evidence that the show remained capable of being being itself, even after losing the most irreplaceable seeming thing it had. Most viewers ended up somewhere between those two positions, which is probably the most honest place to land. Something had been lost, something had survived. The relationship between those two facts was uncomfortable and did not resolve neatly, which was, perhaps appropriately, exactly the kind of conclusion Rick and Morty had always been most interested in exploring. Season 8 was confirmed and eventually premiered in May 2025, with Cardone and Belden returning in their roles. The show had been renewed through Season 12 under its long-term deal with Adult Swim. The machine kept moving, the episodes kept coming, the audience kept showing up, in numbers that were smaller than the peak years, but substantial enough to justify the network's continued investment. Rick and Morty was still on television. It was still being made. It was still, by most critical measures, a show worth watching. What it was no longer was the thing it had been when two people whose names used to appear in the opening credits sat in an unfurnished office on the Paramount lot and wrote the first draft in 6 hours and thought they were just making a cartoon. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 7 proved the show could keep going, but keeping going and being whole are different things. What remained after everything that had happened was a show carrying the weight of its own history in ways that most of its audience was still quietly processing. Section 10. What remains? There is a question that sits underneath every story like this one, and it is not the most obvious question. The obvious question is, what happened? The answer to that one is now largely on the record. A show was created by two people whose partnership deteriorated privately while their names remained publicly linked. One of those people had a past that resurfaced at the worst moment and addressed it with more honesty than most. The other had been arrested on felony charges in 2020 and continued working for 2.5 years while that information stayed buried in a court system nobody was watching closely enough. The charges were eventually dismissed. The professional relationships were not restored. The show kept going with new voices and an altered credit sequence and a fandom that had been through more in a short period than most fan communities encounter across an entire decade. That is what happened. The harder question is what it means. Not in a grand philosophical sense, but in the specific practical sense of what this story reveals about the systems and structures that surround popular culture, and the ways those systems decide what gets seen and what stays hidden. Rick and Morty is not a unique case. The broad outline of this story, a celebrated creative figure whose private behavior was significantly worse than his public image, whose institutional environment had strong financial incentives to look past that behavior, whose audience had no idea what was happening until external pressure made concealment impossible, is a story that has appeared in entertainment journalism repeatedly over the past decade. The specific details change. The industry changes. The particular combination of talent and dysfunction and institutional tolerance changes, but the structure of it is recognizable. What makes the Rick and Morty version of this story worth examining closely is how many different layers of concealment operated simultaneously. There was the concealment of the show's origins, the Doc and Marty short that both creators were content to let exist in a quiet corner of the internet rather than discuss openly. There was the concealment of the partnership's deterioration, the years of silence between the co-creators presented to the public as an ongoing collaboration. There was the concealment of the production difficulties, the mediator and the shrinking episode orders, and the disappearing from writers' rooms framed as simple creative slowness. There was the concealment of the criminal charges, the most consequential silence of all, which held for over 2 years while the show kept airing and the promotional machine kept running and the audience kept watching. None of these concealments required a conspiracy. None of them required a room full of people explicitly deciding to hide something. They required only the ordinary operation of institutions that prioritize their own continuity, combined with the ordinary human tendency to avoid confronting things that are uncomfortable until avoidance becomes impossible. Those two forces, institutional self-preservation and personal avoidance, are enough to keep a great deal of information out of public view for a very long time. The audience, throughout all of this, was the party with the least information and the most investment. Fans of Rick and Morty had given years of their attention and genuine emotional energy to a show whose production was shaped by circumstances they knew nothing about. They had waded through season gaps without understanding what was actually causing them. They had watched a show that presented itself as the product of a creative partnership that had effectively ended years before they were told. They had built communities and identities and relationships around something whose internal reality was considerably darker than its external presentation. This is not an accusation directed at the audience. They could not have known what they were not told. The information was not available to them. But there is something worth sitting with in the asymmetry of it. The people who made the show knew, in varying degrees, what was happening behind it. The people who watched it knew only what they were shown. That gap between what makers know and what audiences are given is a structural feature of how popular culture operates, and the Rick and Morty story is one of the more complete illustrations of how wide that gap can get. Dan Harmon remains the credited creative force behind the show as it continues into its later seasons. His own history, the 2009 video and the community writers' room situation, has been processed and largely set aside by an industry that accepted his apologies and moved on. Whether that processing was appropriate is a judgment that different people reach differently. What is observable is that he continued working, that the show continued under his stewardship, and that Season 7 and the seasons following it have been received as legitimate continuations of the Rick and Morty project, rather than as hollow imitations of it. Justin Roiland's situation is considerably less resolved. The criminal charges were dismissed. The professional relationships remain severed. The allegations, published in the September 2023 NBC News report, have not been adjudicated in any formal legal sense. He posted on social media in the period following the dismissal of charges, expressing a desire to move forward, to restore his reputation, to return to creative work. As of the time this is being written, his public profile has remained significantly diminished compared to what it was before January 2023. The shows he created continue without him. The characters whose voices he invented are now voiced by other people. The video game studio he co-founded operates without his involvement. The question of how to relate to his creative work, specifically to the first 6 seasons of Rick and Morty, in which his voice performances were central to the show's identity, is one that individual viewers are left to answer for themselves.
There is no institutional guidance on this. Adult Swim has not told people how to feel about the earlier seasons. Harmon has not issued instructions. The cultural conversation has not reached anything approaching consensus. Some people have stopped watching entirely. Some people watch the earlier seasons and the newer ones without much internal conflict. Some people find themselves somewhere in the middle, able to appreciate what existed while holding the knowledge of what was happening alongside it with varying degrees of difficulty. This is the unresolved space that stories like this always leave behind. The work does not disappear. The earlier seasons of Rick and Morty are still available to watch. The jokes are still funny or not funny, independent of who made them. The emotional moments still land or do not land based on whether the writing earned them. The show's genuine achievements, and there are genuine achievements across its run, do not simply cease to exist because of what emerged about one of its creators, but they are also not untouched by that knowledge, at least not for people who choose to hold both things at once. What the show looks like from this distance, with the benefit of knowing the full shape of its history, is something more complicated and more human than the version of it that existed in public understanding during its peak years. It is a show that was made under genuinely difficult conditions by people who were, in different ways and to different degrees, struggling with things that had nothing to do with science fiction or interdimensional travel or the question of whether nihilism is a philosophy or a wound. It is a show that produced real art alongside real harm, that generated genuine community alongside genuine damage, that told stories about the gap between how people present themselves and what they are actually doing, with a precision that turned out to be more autobiographical than anyone watching at home had reason to suspect. Rick Sanchez, the character, is a man who performs certainty and contempt while being driven by things he cannot bring himself to name directly. He builds elaborate structures of deflection around a core of something he will not look at. He is most honest in the moments when he thinks nobody is watching, or when the situation has become so extreme that honesty is the only option left. The show, at its best, understood this about him and used it to say something true about how people work. It is hard, now, not to find a particular resonance in that portrait. Not because the creators and the character are the same person, they are not, but because the story of how this show was made, the deflections and the silences and the elaborate professional structures built around things that were not being looked at directly, has the shape of the thing the show was trying to describe. The gap between the presented self and the actual self. The maintenance of a surface while something very different operates underneath it. Whether that resonance is meaningful or simply coincidental is a question that probably has no clean answer. Shows do not always reflect their creators in legible ways. The relationship between what someone makes and who they are is complicated and indirect and cannot usually be read as straightforwardly as hindsight makes it tempting to. What can be said with more confidence is that Rick and Morty's history is a useful illustration of how much stays hidden in plain sight. The show was one of the most analyzed pieces of popular culture of its era. Thousands of video essays and articles and forum posts and academic papers examining
examined it from every conceivable angle. Its themes were discussed at length, its character psychology was mapped carefully, its cultural impact was measured and argued over and celebrated and criticized. And through all of that analysis, the actual story of how it was made, what was happening between its creators, what one of those creators had been charged with, remained almost entirely outside the conversation until it could no longer be kept there. That is not a failure of the analysis. It is a reminder of what analysis can and cannot see. A video essay about Rick and Morty's exploration of nihilism has access to the episodes. It does not have access to the court filings in Orange County, or the conversations between a co-creator and his attorney, or the meetings between network executives deciding how long to wait before making a public statement. The gap between what is available to analyze and what is actually happening is always larger than it looks from the outside. Rick and Morty continues. Season 9 is set to air in 2026, with Ian Cardone and Harry Belden returning as Rick and Morty. The show has been renewed through season 12. The mythology continues to expand. The writer's room continues to find new stories to tell within a world that has proven more durable than anyone might have expected, given everything that has happened around it. Whether those later seasons will eventually be remembered as a legitimate continuation of something genuinely great,
or as an extended coda to a story that ended when the original voices went away, is something that only time and the quality of the work itself will determine. Both outcomes remain possible. Neither is inevitable. What is already determined is the shape of the history. A short film made in protest in 2006. Two people who met at a festival and built something extraordinary, and then quietly stopped being able to be in the same room. Years of gaps and silences and institutional patience with behavior that warranted something more than patience. Charges filed and hidden and eventually dismissed. Allegations that did not resolve into verdicts, but did not disappear either. A show that lost its original voice and kept going anyway, into a future whose outlines are still being drawn. That is the story of Rick and Morty that most people who love the show were never told. Not because nobody knew it, but because the systems that surround popular culture are very good at deciding what an audience needs to know, and very practiced at making those decisions in their own interest rather than in the audience's. The show about a man who hides what he actually is kept its own secrets longer than almost anyone realized. When the secrets finally came out, the show kept going, which is, in its way, the most Rick and Morty ending possible. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.